One of the most feared and ruthless mobsters to ever walk the streets of New York, Dutch Schultz made millions in the 1920s and 30s by murdering, enforcing and intimidating his way up the ladder of organised crime, leaving anyone who stood in his way sinking to the bottom of the East River encased in a pair of concrete boots, whilst he watched from his boat the air bubbles that broke the surface eventually stop, often smiling with satisfaction. Quite rightly portrayed as psychotic and bloodthirsty by both Tim Roth in the 1997 film Hoodlum and a few years earlier by Dustin Hoffman in Billy Bathgate, crime ran rich in the blood of this German immigrant who was dragged up in the slums of the Bronx and rose to the top of the New York underworld whilst threatening to destroy everyone around him in the process. York at the turn of the 20th century. A city which had become the financial centre of the United States since the end of the Civil War in 1865, 35 years earlier. Politics was now in a progressive era, and this, combined with being the new financial hub of the United States, brought an enormous growth in industry, population and wealth. Wealth that financed cutting-edge technology and construction. Major new bridges were built between Manhattan, Brooklyn and Queens, which enabled commuting and a huge industrial base. A state-of-the-art subway system was the heart and soul of the city, a city that also expanded its port facilities, improved its traffic system, built hundreds of new elementary and high schools, and engaged in large-scale public health programs. This was the nuts and guts of their work, but being New York, they needed to show off, and many of the largest buildings in the world, now nicknamed skyscrapers, were built in Manhattan during this time, including the Park Row building and the Manhattan Life Insurance building on Broadway. Words spread, postcards were printed and dreams were dreamt by millions worldwide. A new metropolis, a new start in a modern and forward-thinking city and country. All you needed for this new life was your fare to sail to the promised land and all your dreams would come true. Aspirations blossomed in the hearts of millions and European immigration witnessed a significant surge, welcoming a wave of Irish, Italian and Polish Catholics, along with Yiddish-speaking Jews from Eastern Europe and Germany. Two of those aforementioned blossoming hearts that had just stepped foot onto the busy floorboards of Ellis Island, the immigrant inspection and processing station of the States, were Herman and Emma Flegenheimer. A young German-Jewish couple whose hope-filled hearts were only amplified sailing past the Statue of Liberty a few minutes earlier. They hailed from a small tobacco farming village called Turnbach, south of Frankfurt, and had learned of the promised life that America offered a few years prior. They were both 28 and had saved up their weekly wage to afford their ticket to a better life. After the cattle farm-like intrusion and inspection carried out by the guards of Ellis Island, the young couple settled in the Upper East Side, as many German-Jewish immigrants did at the time. They were married in Manhattan on November the 10th, 1900, and they must have had a late night on their wedding day, as nearly exactly 9 months later, on August the 6th, 1901, they had their first child, a son they named Arthur, who was delivered at their Yorkville home, 1690 2nd Avenue, off 89th Street. Emma and Herman were not religious and never took Arthur to a synagogue, although I imagine even if they did, that wouldn't help this young boy, who was at first so innocent and full of life, but would eventually go on to be one of the most feared mob bosses in the whole of America. Herman found work as a baker, then a glazer, and for a while he ran a livery stable. He later ran a saloon in Yorkville, and his clientele were the German-Jewish immigrants that he associated himself with and sailed over to the promised land with. Emma was a housewife and raised young Arthur and his sister Helen, born 3 years later in 1904. Life was tough for the Flegenheimers. The promised land turned out to be nothing like the postcards, and they'd been sold a dream. The blossom in their hearts had quickly wilted a few days after their stones had hit the horseman yaw-soaked cobblestones of New York. This was supposed to be a forward-thinking city, a city with the tallest buildings that offered countless opportunities, the best public health facilities in the world, and where dreams came true. In reality, this was a city that failed to provide proper housing, safety, or hygienic conditions for over 66% of its population. The Flegenheimers quickly realised that the living conditions in the city were far worse than what they had left behind in Europe, except for the prospect of employment. Not just the Flegenheimers, but life for the average immigrant of New York City during this immigration wave was challenging. Upon arrival, they often faced hostility from Americans biased against newcomers. Once they secured residency, typically in crowded tenement buildings of which 16 92nd Avenue as definitely one of, they were confronted with severe overcrowding, limited access to water and hygiene facilities, and frequent outbreaks of diseases like cholera and typhus. Families of 10 to 15 people were crammed into two small rooms, one serving as a kitchen and the other as a bedroom. By 1900, more than 2/3 of the population lived in such conditions in around 80,000 largely unregulated tenement buildings. Organised crime flourished even as iconic buildings were constructed and Macy's department store emerged. In 1890, Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives, catching the attention of New York City Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt. However, the call for improving immigrant lives was slow to be acted on. Issues such as child labour, forced prostitution and economic exploitation persisted for decades. One day, these grimy conditions proved all too much for Herman Flegenheimer, and he quickly abandoned the household before Arthur's 8th birthday. This event ripped apart the family and deeply traumatised young Arthur, who would spend the rest of his years denying that his father deserted him and instead told friends, enemies and reporters that his father had died, quickly changing the subject. Emma Flegenheimer decided that the conditions in Yorkville were not suitable to raise her son and daughter, and she decided to move into another tenement building in the lower Bronx. Arthur remained deeply affected by his father's decision to leave them in the lurch, and this quickly began to surface when his behaviour spiralled out of control as he began his education at Public School 12 in the Bronx, where, interestingly, his principal was Dr. John F. Condon, the man who in 1932 had tossed a $50,000 ransom money for the Lindbergh baby over the wall in St. Raymond's Cemetery. By all accounts, Arthur was a bully at school, threatening and extorting other students for the little money they had. He sowed the seeds during his school days, which would soon sprout into him being a full-blown menace in later life. Academically, however, Arthur was no slouch. An avid reader, something that he carried with him into later life. At school, he was noted to have particularly excelled in both history and composition. This is all that remains today of Public School 12, located in Westchester Square. A car park now occupies the majority of where the school stood and where Arthur ran riot at lunchtime. The part of the building still standing is now used as offices for the School Maintenance Bureau. Interestingly, a new Public School 12 has been erected nearby, and it hosts students who are troubled youngsters, most sent there by juvenile courts. Perhaps rather fitting, as this is somewhere Arthur would have definitely been in contention of attending if they had them in 1910. Fast forward to 1915 and Arthur is now 14 and has just quit school in the 6th grade to find work to support his family. His mother Emma has found it hard to support Arthur and his sister Helen since Herman abandoned the family, and Arthur decided his time would have been better spent trying to make ends meet on the vicious and knife-plunging streets of the Bronx. He began selling papers and subway transfers around the busy station at 149th Street and 3rd Avenue in the South Bronx's hub. He then progressed to becoming an office boy and running errands for local businesses where the pay was more steady and it was not as cold as standing outside the station in those harsh New York winters. As Arthur got a little older, he began to work as a feeder and pressman in the factories of the Clark Loose Leaf Company, then Caxton Press, and finally for American Express of all companies. He later also worked with composition roofing and as a trucker for a local Bronx company called Schultz Trucking before quitting when he was 17, as he quickly realised that crime paid better than an honest day's work. "I didn't want to work a regular 9 to 5 like the rest of the other schmucks," he would so profoundly and poetically explain in a later interview. Exceptionally gifted at pool, he began hustling none the wiser old-timers in the Bronx bars and gained a reputation as a tough pool shark. Once he had relieved the naive punters of their dollar and dimes, occasionally he would encounter an opponent who didn't appreciate that he'd been conned into thinking Arthur was a bad player after upping his stakes on the next game, and this is where he began making a name for himself in the Bronx underworld. The irate reveller demanding his money back would often be met with a pool cue wrapped around his head. Other times a pool ball in a sock would be the weapon of choice. Sometimes a good old-fashioned fist fight would usually calm down the hustled player before Arthur had to draw for one of the many weapons he kept on his person. It was presumably during these early days of making an easy dollar that he caught the eye of the local Bergen gang, whose headquarters was the Bergen Social Club, a stone's throw from the Yankee Stadium, home of the New York Yankees. From here, whilst Babe Ruth was making a name for himself in the Yankee Stadium, Arthur was making a name for himself in the streets that surrounded it, mixing in various crime circles and eventually meeting a mentor figure called Marcel Poffo in the Criterion Club. A local hoodlum, Marcel was that you can make more on the streets of New York than you ever could as a feeder pressman in its factories. They began stealing packages off delivery trucks, looting neighbourhood stores, breaking into apartments, and Arthur particularly found a talent for sticking up dice games that wouldn't pay for protection or a percentage to the duo. A decorated Bronx detective who knew Arthur in these wild months running with Marcel spoke to a newspaper a few years later and remembered Arthur as a tough teenager who you couldn't walk past without being intimidated by or questioned. This is Fred Shadle, the affable and sizable police officer who became the human target on the day that notorious Francis Two Gun Crowley earned his moniker. This event unfolded in March 1931 when the brother-in-law of Crowley's invited Shadle to a downtown Manhattan office building to facilitate the surrender of the youthful outlaw wanted for a double murder in the Bronx. Crowley did appear and willingly surrendered his firearm to the detective. However, he abruptly changed his mind at the last moment, producing a smaller weapon from his shirt sleeve and unleashed a barrage of bullets, striking Shadle in the pelvis, bladder and thigh before making his escape. Despite Shadle's recovery, Crowley met his fate in a Hollywood-style shootout with 150 police officers at West Side Boarding House on May the 7th. Detective Johnny Broderick eventually apprehended him, leading to Crowley's execution in the electric chair at Sing Sing prison 8 months later, marking the end of Crowley's criminal exploits. I have covered Two Gun Crowley's life and last meal before, so you can watch that by clicking the card on the screen now. But back to Shadle, who contrasts the infamous Two Gun Crowley with the Arthur Flegenheimer he knew, acknowledging Arthur's occasional bad temper but insisting that he was not comparable to the gun-obsessed animal that Crowley was. Reflecting on the past, Shadle recalls young Arthur as one of the street corner toughs in the old Morrisania district gang, which included Vincent Coll, a man who will later be dubbed Mad Dog, become a rival and scare Arthur into reclusiveness. Shadle, a resident of the same movement in the recollections, he remembers that a roofer in the neighbourhood occasionally enlisted Arthur and his friends for odd jobs. I guess this was a composite roofing work. Emma Flegenheimer, Arthur's mother, was now facing dire circumstances after her husband Herman had disappeared and had been working as the janitor of the Bronx tenement they lived in, supplementing their income by taking in washing. Shadle recalls that the Flegenheimers had it worse than most families, which is initially why Arthur began terrorising the streets of the Bronx. It was during this reign of terror on those streets that Arthur received his first and only prison sentence. He was caught red-handed in the middle of breaking into a Bronx apartment. Along with this mugshot, Arthur gave the name Charles Harmon, an alias he would use throughout his criminal career. He was sent to Blackwell's Island Penitentiary, built in 1832 because the treacherous tides of the East River would make escape almost impossible. It was the Alcatraz of its day. It later became known as Welfare Island, and today we know it as Roosevelt Island. However, the Blackwell's Island Penitentiary spell for Arthur did absolutely nothing to rehabilitate him, and just like at Public School 12, he proved himself to be a dangerous and tricky inmate. Eventually, the prison guards found him so unmanageable that in 1919 he was transferred from Blackwell's Island to West Hampton Prison Farms near Goshen. However, Arthur didn't take to that correctional institution either and broke out. He was recaptured after just 15 hours on the lam and had another 2 months slapped onto his sentence. He served 15 months in total, the only 15 months he would ever spend behind bars. Between the stints at Blackwell's Island and West Hampton, he returned to the Bronx streets suitably hardened and a time-served criminal. He adopted the new name of Dutch Schultz, a nickname he borrowed from a much-feared brawler in the early days of the Frog Hollow Gang, an Italian gang who operated from Frog Hollow, a predominantly Italian part of the Bronx. Arthur, or Dutch Schultz as he was now known, had matured somewhat in prison. He now sported a jaunty cap and chewing tobacco as we entered the early days of Prohibition, or the 18th Amendment as it was known. Prohibition was first suggested by a group of wives of alcoholic husbands who had had enough of their spouses spending the rent money in saloons. They were spearheaded by a crazed religious maniac called Carrie Nation. Carrie believed she had a call from God to stop Americans drinking alcohol and would often march into a saloon singing or praying while smashing the place up with a hatchet in which she had engraved onto the wooden handle, "Death to Rum." Between 1900 and 1910, she was arrested 30 times for this public show of criminal damage, or hatchetations as she liked to call them. In one hatchetation, she travelled to Kansas City, a place that was well known in its opposition to Prohibition. She marched down 12th Street in downtown Kansas with a trusty hatchet and smashed up hundreds of bottles of liquor and numerous bars until she was finally arrested. Landlords and bartenders were so fearful that their drinking hole might be the next to suffer a hatchetation that they invested in cannons and would often wheel them out when she came walking down the road. This became the only tactic that would deter her. Signs that read "All Nations Welcome except for Carrie" became bar staples, and her antics became known nationwide. I think Carrie Nation is a video for another day, but currently, in Dutch Schultz's world, the ruling fathers of Washington had just declared booze and spirits null, void, evil, and against the law. The Roaring Twenties were in their infancy, but certainly transpiring. America was going through a social revolution coming off the back of World War I. Society was changing as inhibitions faded and the youth demanded more experiences and freedom. Arthur, now 18 and fresh out of penitentiary, was parading the Bronx streets and back alleys looking for the next quick buck. They were streets which had begun welcoming some more affluent citizens of New York in recent weeks due to the fact that the Bronx was littered with speakeasies, secret bars where alcohol was still served despite prohibition being in place. Such establishments in the Bronx were one like the Hub's Criterion restaurant, close to where a younger Arthur would sell papers and subway transfers. The Criterion restaurant was run by Billy Gibson, a boxing promoter and one-time manager of both Gene Tunney and Billy Leonard, both respectively good boxers of their day. Another establishment which seemed to turn a blind eye to prohibition was the famous Manhattan mobster Jack Legs Diamond's Bronx Theatrical Club across the road from the Criterion. These speakeasies were cropping up all over New York and quite boldly sticking their finger up to the law and selling alcohol on their premises. It became quite clear to Dutch Schultz that there was money to be had in alcohol, and quite a lot of it too. This is where the Dutchman will take his first step into notoriety and stardom, where he will leave the paper selling and office errand running days behind. In a previous employment at Schultz Trucking, a time in his pre-prison life that might have inspired his new nickname, he used to help on the wagons for brothers Otto and Jake Gass, who owned the company, and in turn worked for the mobster and bankroller Arnold Rothstein. With the advent of prohibition, the Gass brothers had realised that there was a bigger buck to be made in transporting beer for Rothstein than almost any other profession, and so they jettisoned their usual cargo and filled their trucks with cold, fizzy, illegal beer. It was here whilst working on the trucks for Arnold Rothstein that Dutch first met Lucky Luciano, another understudy of Rothstein trying to make his way in the world. It's also during this time that Arthur shows the ruthless nature that will stick with him throughout the duration of his life when he shoots and kills a rival rum runner. Another friend of Schultz's named Joey Noy, whose father was a beer pipe cleaner, also found out that there was more money in the beer inside the barrel than cleaning out the pipes it ran through. Beer cost $4 a keg back then. It then went to the illicit distributors, someone like Schultz Trucking for example, for $9, and once delivered to a speakeasy, a whole barrel would fetch around $20. Not a bad profit at all. Joey and Dutch were both significantly attracted to these straightforward economic principles, and it was Joey who made the first move into becoming a bootlegger. Joey and Dutch had been inseparable since his mother Emma made the decision to move away from Yorkville to the lower Bronx. Joey was only an inch taller but much tougher. He was the only man that Dutch ever took an order from. He was also the only man Dutch allowed to call him Arthur, and the only person he took along to see his mother when he later moved out of the tenement building she was doing the washing of to support him as a child and into his own place. The pair knew that the bootlegging industry was competitive at present and also incredibly violent, something they were both accustomed to. They came up with a cunning and ingenious plan for Arthur to become deputy sheriff of the Bronx. This would allow him to carry a firearm without being arrested. Using the proceedings of the money Arthur made whilst running with Marcel Poffo before his stretch in jail, they bribed the sheriff of the Bronx, Edward J. Flynn, who would later be a leading Democratic politician leading the Bronx Democratic Party and a close friend of both presidents Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman, to appoint Arthur the unpaid deputy sheriff of the Bronx, to which he accepted with dollar signs in his eyes, and hilariously, Dutch Schultz held a brass deputy sheriff badge which allowed him to carry his trusty Colt revolver, something he'd grow very close to, freely in public. This was not good news for the fellow budding bootleggers of the Bronx, as Arthur would not be afraid to use his pistol to get what he wanted. As Joey Noy, a seasoned and hardened criminal himself, would put a few years later, when Arthur was around, I gave my armed guard a night off. Joey and Arthur set up a hole-in-the-wall speakeasy in Joey's tenement building at 543 Brook Avenue. The Hub Social Club, as the duo named it, was in the shop on the left, disguised as a regular convenience store here, but it was not only candy, cigars and soda they sold inside. Illegal beer was flowing thanks to the connections of the pair, and Otto and Jake Gass from Schultz Trucking made regular deliveries, and by 1928 the regulars of the Hub Social Club claimed it to be the best beer in the Bronx. Joey and Arthur, both in their mid-20s now, set up several watering holes with their Brook Avenue profits, and it took no time for them to decide they may as well provide the beer for their rival speakeasies that were littered in abundance around the Bronx as well. Otto and Jake Gass introduced them to their brewer, a man called Frankie Dunn out of Union City in New Jersey, and the pair invested in 3 old trucks to transport the beer from New Jersey. Soon they were ready to start providing the beer to other speakeasies, some which didn't quite like the idea at first. However, Arthur and Joey were enormously persuasive, as author Paul Sand Mann writes in his book On Arthur's Life, Kill the Dutchman. It was just like the movies of the time. Somebody came into the joint, tilted his fedora back on his head, ordered a beer, licked his lips, made a face, said something about the brew being unfit for human consumption, asked where the slop was coming from, and then said, well, from now on you gotta buy it from us. After that, you bought it from us, or us came back with some helpers and wrecked your joint, never failing to open up all the taps in the process. With these intimidating and convincing tactics rolled out to several joints across the Bronx, most complied with the duo and began buying beer from them. After disposing of a few competing beer salesmen, they had effectively set up quite a nice monopoly for themselves, emanating from their Mott Haven focal bar, the Hub Social Club, and were beginning to make names for themselves across New York. Naturally, in the pursuit of profit, and is the case with any business venture, Joey and Arthur did encounter some adversaries, however, notably in the form of the defiant Rock brothers, John and Joe, who had long established territory in the Bronx and had a foothold there whilst Joey and Arthur were still loitering on street corners. As the pair began throwing their weight around and applying pressure onto the Rock brothers, the elder brother, John, stepped aside with a modest show of resistance. However, Joe, showcasing his resilient Irish spirit, persisted to decline to step back from the beer business, and for this he paid an astonishingly high price, with Dutch Schultz showcasing the first display of why he later earned a reputation of a monster across New York. One night, Joey and Arthur kidnapped Joe Rock and beat the living daylights out of him. They then took him back to one of their warehouses where they stored beer and hung him up by his thumbs on meat hooks, continuing to beat him, breaking a rib at a time. Finally, in a vicious act of cruelty, they blindfolded him with a bandage which Arthur had acquired from a local whorehouse, and more specifically from a prostitute riddled with gonorrhea, causing him to go blind. On the edge of death and now a blind man, Joe Rock was held in the warehouse for ransom money, of which his family had to pay $35,000 to Arthur and Joey to release what was left of their once rival. The Rock brothers were no more, and word spread across the city, which was only stroking the narcissistic egos of Arthur and Joey, who had plans to expand their business across New York. However, they would surely meet greater foe than the Rock brothers in the likes of Manhattan, so they began recruiting for their Bronx Brigade, or the Noise Schultz Gang as it was known, and they put together nothing short of an intimidating army of all the worst killers and triggermen going. Bo Weinberg, a much feared enforcer, was one of their disciples, as was Vincent Coll, who would later be named Mad Dog, and his kid brother Peter. Larry Carney, an aggressive character and an early supporter of Schultz, stood alongside Fatty Walsh, who later served as a bodyguard for mafia kingpin Arnold Rothstein. Joey Rao and Fats McCarthy also became disciples of the Ruthless Dutchman, and this crew of Bronx outlaws made them a force to be reckoned with. A newspaper was quoted at the time as saying you could take over a South American government with a band of killers like that. Their operation was growing at a rapid rate with their new recruits. They had to obtain new suppliers to keep up with the orders from frightened speakeasies, which they were adding to their portfolio, and the modest brewery of Frankie Dunn's in Union City could not keep up. So they began business with two new suppliers who had breweries in New York, Frenchie Dillon and J. Culhane. With a more fruitful supply of beer, and with Frenchie Dillon now on board, the boys were also able to supply gin and whiskey. The Bronx Army were able to expand their territory and move into Manhattan, a long aspiration of both Joey and Arthur's. They began in Manhattan's Upper West Side and into the neighbourhoods of Washington Heights, Yorkville and Harlem, where their business flourished. With this increase in the pair's net worth, they bought an old warehouse near the Mott Haven Railroad yards, which they revamped and moved underground. They called it the Tins, and it was practically a showpiece. It was that elaborate that it made any other bootlegging operation in the country seem mediocre. It was equipped with disappearing elevators which took huge empty beer trucks underground and fully restocked them, ready to go on their way, not only to the Bronx but also to their newly acquired neighbourhoods in Manhattan. Their modest little operation, originating from Joey Noy's tenement building on Brook Avenue, was now big time, and they relocated their headquarters from that tenement building to an office building on East 149th Street. In typical Arthur and Joey fashion, however, this wasn't a normal office building. The walls of the office were lined with thick steel, and the door was also similarly bulletproof. They also had a bookcase which revolved and revealed an arsenal of weapons on the other side if the gang needed them. To meet Joey and Arthur, you had to first get past one of their lieutenants who sat behind a bulletproof 10-inch peephole, and once you got past him, Fats McCarthy and Bo Weinberg sat by the door with Thompson submachine guns. The duo knew that muscling into Manhattan could bring trouble and were taking their safety seriously, and for good reason. On the night of October the 28th, 1928, Joey and Arthur, still inseparable, dropped into the Swanee Club under the famous Apollo Theatre on West 125th Street in Harlem. The duo were now tasting the fruits of their labour and living the high life. The Swanee Swanee was a universal neutral ground for men who lived dangerously, and no mobster nor rum runner would ever dream of firing a gun in there. The rule was that if you encountered a rival mobster, you had one drink and got out of there, unless the rival volunteered to leave first. It was a safe haven for the likes of Dutch and Joey, as it was also frequented by most off-duty cops in the area who, obviously, didn't adhere to the rules of prohibition. It was one of the Dutchman's favourite spots, and on this evening he was drinking whiskey until the early hours of the morning when Joey Noy, the only man Dutch ever took an order from, insisted that they had to go downtown to deal with some business. Dutch drove Joey in his Ford sedan downtown to a hotel called the Chateau Madrid, where the pair conducted business before Dutch left. A short time later, around 7 a.m, the residents of West 54th Street were awoken by a roar of gunfire and had them rushing to their windows to see a blue Cadillac speeding erratically away before their eyes focused on the sidewalk in front of the Chateau Madrid, where a man lay injured, desperately returning fire at the Cadillac which had just hit a parked car and driven off. The man was Joey Noy. He had been ambushed and shot in his right breast, left hand and spine. All that remained on the scene with Joey was the door of the Cadillac, which had fallen off when it hit the parked car. Joey was still alive, just. He was desperately wounded but coherent. Rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, he denied knowing his assailant and explained that he was just parking his car when two guys began shooting at him. Upon further questioning from the police, he snapped and explained, "I'll take care of it myself." The Dutchman was alerted and immediately visited his partner in hospital. Within an hour of Dutch leaving Roosevelt Hospital, a blue Cadillac with a door missing containing the bullet-ridden body of Louis Weinberg was found on the Lower East Side. The police quickly established this was the man who exchanged gunfire with Joey Noy, and in fact, Joey did know his assailant. He was just waiting for his trusty right-hand man to turn up. They put two and two together and transferred Joey to the Bellevue Hospital prison ward unless he agreed to speak. After a few weeks, however, it was physically impossible for Joey to speak. The damage from the bullets had caused infection in his body and he wasted away to 90 pounds before eventually succumbing to his injuries on November the 21st. Dutch Schultz was at his bedside the whole time. Schultz was caught up by the loss of his partner. Joey was the closest friend he would ever have, and he'd just been ripped from him. He was crushed. When he apprenticed for Marcel Poffo, he may have drawn some inspiration, but Noy, the only man who went to see his mother with him, called him Arthur as he did when they were running as kids on the Bronx streets without a care in the world, told him when to stop drinking after he got giddy in late night bars, and had any kind of authority over the Dutchman at all, was now dead, and it'll be a cold day in hell before Dutch Schultz let whoever was behind the hit get away with it. But who was behind the hit? Like Noy, Dutch won't tell the police after he leaves Joey's deathbed and is questioned on his knowledge. Yes, Louis Weinberg turned up dead, but he was only a soldier. He wasn't behind the hit. However, Schultz does have the knowledge. Since they muscled into Manhattan, they'd been upsetting a few people, namely fellow mobster Jack Legs Diamond. Manhattan was his territory, and it was the clientele frequenting his Bronx theatrical club which inspired Arthur to get involved in bootlegging in the first place. Arthur and Joey had pushed Diamond out of the Bronx as they strived for complete dominance in the beer business the year before, and Diamond had kept a grudge, especially now since they were encroaching onto his Manhattan territory. Noy had also told Dutch in the Swanee Club earlier that evening that he was picking up some money from Diamond that he owed to the Bronx boys. The two factions were civil and used to help each other out when one supplier would fall short, despite the animosity Diamond held towards Joey and Arthur for muscling in. Apparently it seems, however, one day the animosity took over him as he planned to take out both of them that same morning. Dutch told Joey in the Swanee Club that he would come with him, and someone who overheard their conversation or who was sitting at the table with them informed Diamond that both would be there, and he tried to seize the opportunity. With Joey and Arthur gone, Manhattan would be his once more. However, with Arthur leaving a few minutes before the hit took place, he only took out 50% of the leaders of the Bronx boys, and he took out the more reasonable and level-headed half in Joey Noy, effectively signing his own death warrant at the time. Dutch, whiskey drunk and hell-bent on revenge, tried to assassinate Diamond in the years that followed, while slowly absorbing his empire in Manhattan. The first assassination attempt came in 1930 when two of Schultz's men, possibly Bo Weinberg and Fats McCarthy, forced their way into Diamond's room at the Hotel Monticello on Manhattan's west side and unleashed 5 slugs into his body before fleeing, thinking that they had put an end to the biggest bootlegger in Manhattan. However, Diamond survived. He managed to pull himself from his blood-stained bed, downed 2 shots of whiskey and staggered to the hallway of the hotel and collapsed, alerting other guests who rushed him to the polyclinic hospital, and he made a full recovery. During Legs Diamond's hospital stay, he was forced to relinquish most of his Manhattan territory, including the popular Hotsy Totsy Club, to Schultz, and by the end of April 1931, he was trying to carve out new territory for himself in Albany, 150 miles away from his his ex-stomping ground of Broadway. Dutch got word of a restaurant Legs supplied beer to and liked to frequent with his goons called the Aratoga Inn near Cairo in the Catskills. As he finished up with 3 companions who he was negotiating booze business with, he was ambushed and shot 3 times by Schultz's men and collapsed by the front door. With wounds that any mere mortal would have succumbed to, a local resident who had grown fond of Legs and his ability to keep the small town flowing with beer drove him down to a hospital in Albany where he again miraculously recovered. The Manhattan papers got wind of his recovery and dubbed him the clay pigeon of the underworld, as astonishingly before this beef with the Dutchman, Diamond had survived 2 more shootings in 1925 and 1927. Upon reading that Diamond had survived, Dutch bellowed in a common outrage, "Ain't there nobody who can shoot this guy so he don't bounce back?" His anger must have resonated with the Bronx boys as on December the 18th, 1931, someone did shoot this guy and he didn't bounce back. Still exiled from Manhattan with Dutch imposing a shoot-on-sight order should Legs' handmade brogues ever touch the streets of the city again, Diamond was staying in a cheap rooming house at 67 Dove Street in Albany whilst on trial for a separate kidnapping that happened in Troy. On the night of his acquittal, to celebrate, Diamond, his family and his friends ate and drank at an Albany restaurant before the night continued with his ever-loyal first wife Alice and then with his real love, showgirl Kiki Roberts, where at 1 a.m. they went to their room at the Kenmore Hotel. Around 4:30 a.m, Diamond drunkenly returned and passed out on his bed at 67 Dove Street. Around an hour later, Bo Weinberg entered the room with another Schultz loyalist who held Diamond down as Bo volleyed 3 bullets into the whiskey-soaked brain of Legs Diamond. This time, the clay pigeon of the underworld was dead, and at last, satisfaction and revenge for Dutch, who had avenged the death of his partner Joey Noy. Upon his death, Diamond had taken a total of 14 bullets in his life, surviving all but the 3 put into his head this night. But the violence wasn't about to cease now. The successes of the 1920s faded and the limitless prosperity and excitement of the early 1930s began to take hold of the Dutchman. Schultz had inherited the whole business since Noy had passed and was now fabulously wealthy and in his late 20s. The papers were now dubbing him the beer baron of the Bronx, a name the narcissistic Schultz loved as long as the papers wrote highly of him. He had a love-hate relationship with the press throughout his life. They once dubbed him looking like Bing Crosby with his face smashed in, and that he looks like an overdressed vagrant with his clothes never quite fitting his 5'7" scrawny frame. Another time he declined an interview with the same reporter who once wrote that he had a weakness for blondes. However, he would often give interviews to the press. In one interview, defending his actions as a bootlegger and violent mobster, he told a reporter, "I may do a lot of lousy things, but I'll never make a book off a woman or narcotics." He was quite happy to give his books to the women, however, often frequenting Polly Adler's brothel in Manhattan and quite possibly the place he acquired the gonorrhea soap bandage he used to blind one-time Bronx enemy Joe Rock. Despite his lack of self-awareness and hypocrisy, the sky seemed the limit for the Dutchman. However, his Bronx boys were growing restless and Vincent Coll, who realised he was nothing more than a hired killer for Dutch, demanded to be cutting on his business now that Joey Noy was dead. But Schultz only had and will only ever have one partner and absolutely rejects Coll's advances with an iron fist. Coll was enraged at Schultz's dismissive rejection and took some of the merry men of the Bronx boys with him to start a rebel gang of their own. Coll was a high-spirited and good-looking gangster, an athletic 5'10" with curly hair, a dimpled chin and a face that might have made the movies had he not chosen the gun, declared all-out war on the Dutchman. Almost overnight, Schultz's beer trucks began to fall to hijackers, and with this, Schultz's men began to die. Vincent Coll was a cold-blooded killer. He had personally been chosen by Manhattan eventual boss of all bosses, Lucky Luciano, to assassinate the current Cosa Nostra chief, Salvatore Maranzano. To put it frank, that is some task, and it just shows the reputation he had around the city. Maranzano got wind that Coll, or the Mick as he was referred to, was contracted to murder him. When Luciano found out Maranzano was aware, he sent his trusty Murder Inc. to carry out the killing instead. Luciano had picked an Irish hitman over all the soldiers in his own army, which shows the kind of enemy Schultz had just made. Coll, lacking significant business acumen, compensated this with an almost impulsive fearlessness. His initial venture after leaving Schultz's side involved plotting the abduction of a local radio and nightclub personality, intending to finance his new gang with ransom money. However, the kidnapping plot unravelled, leading to the arrest of around 8 members of Coll's gang. The police seized the Mad Mick's arsenal and several cars. After this, he was in desperate need of money. Coll and his associates hopped into a sedan and drove over to the club Argonaut on 7th Avenue. There they kidnapped the club's owner, George Big Frenchy DeMonge, an associate of Oni the Killer Madden, the owner of Harlem's Cotton Club and a real heavyweight of New York, even someone Schultz wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of. DeMonge wasn't just an associate of Oni Madden's, he was a partner in a string of Manhattan rackets ranging all the way from booze to extortion to protection to boxing matches. Oni Madden had power in Manhattan that rivaled the police force, and here was the Mad Mick kidnapping his partner in Midtown Manhattan right on Madden's turf. How brazen can you get? Around midnight after he kidnapped DeMonge, Carl called Madden and arranged to meet up. Madden paid $35,000 for DeMonge's release and began plotting his revenge. On July the 28th, 1931, in the middle of a war that had already taken around 40 lives on both the Cole and Schultz side, New York City witnessed one of its most notorious gang war killings ever. Instead of lawless gunmen falling to the wayside, 5 innocent children were senselessly shot down in a botched murder attempt on Schultz associate Joey Rayo. On this hot summer's evening, as children played on the sidewalk along East 107th Street and adults leaned out of open windows in the hope of catching a slight breeze, an open touring car containing 5 men slowly made its way down the block. As it passed the Helmar Social Club, the men spotted Joey Rayo lounging out front. With one gunman blasting away with a shotgun and another with an automatic pistol, gang warfare reached an all-time low. 5-year-old Michael Vengali was hit and died the following day. His 7-year-old brother was wounded 5 times, and a 3-year-old, sleeping in a stroller, was hit twice in the back. 2 other children, who were 5 and 14 years of age, received slight wounds but survived. Despite the angry public outcry, including this broadcasted footage of Michael Vengali's mother uncontrollably mourning at his funeral, police were hard-pressed to find anyone in the neighbourhood who would talk to them. Rayo had spotted his assailants and ducked for cover. When the shooting stopped, he stood up and calmly walked away. 5 days later, an eyewitness to the shooting, George Brett, came forward claiming he'd been standing across the street as the touring car drove by. Brett identified Vincent Cole and Frank Giordano, a lesser-known member of the Bronx Boys, as the 2 shooters. When Cole's name was released to the newspapers as the main suspect in the shootings, the press dubbed him the Baby Killer, which later transpired into Mad Dog Cole and gained national attention. Vincent Cole, who was born into a decent family in County Kildare, Ireland, before moving to New York as a child, was now feared across the states. As a nationwide manhunt was on for him, Cole dyed his blonde hair black and grew a mustache. On October the 4th, he was arrested at the Cornish Arms Hotel on 23rd Street near 8th Avenue. In late December 1931, Cole and Giordano were tried for the murder of Michael Vengali. Cole was ably defended by Samuel Leibovitz, one of the city's high-profile defense attorneys. Leibovitz tore apart prosecution witness George Brett during cross-examination. He told the jury that Brett had fabricated the story in the hope of collecting the $30,000 reward being offered for any information that led to the capture of the killers. Leibovitz claimed that Brett had acted in a similar capacity in another case where his testimony could not be substantiated. By the end of the trial, the jury found Brett to be absolutely unreliable. It later came to light that Brett had a speciality of being an eyewitness to a few murder trials in St. Louis and collecting the reward money. He was committed to the psychopathic ward at Bellevue Hospital, the same hospital that Joey Noy died at. Mad Dog and Giordano were acquitted, and Dutch's anxiety regarding this Mad Dog who was out to walk the streets of Manhattan free once more started to skyrocket. There was no way to deal with Cole other than with brute force and violence. He would not agree to a peace conference, and as a newspaper at the time was quoted, Cole caused more trouble for Schultz than the whole of the New York Police Department combined. It may have been the aforementioned anxiety messing with the Dutch's mind. Perhaps it was lack of sleep that the Mad Dog was causing him, or maybe it was just sheer audacity. However, one day Dutch walked into the 42nd Police Precinct in the Bronx and simply meandered into the police detective squad room and offered money to anyone who killed Cole, just like they used to in the Old West. "Look, I want the Mick dead," he said. "He's driving me out of my mind. I'll give a house in Westchester County to any of you guys who knocks him off." There were 3 detectives in the room at the time, and the one who knew the beer baron of the Bronx the best, Fred Shadle from his old neighbourhood, said, "Arthur, do you know what the hell you're saying? You know you're in the Morazania station. I know where I am. I've been here before. I just came to tell you I'll pay good to any cop who kills the Mick." Dutch was escorted out by Shadle, who thought Schultz must have been blind drunk to enter a police station and offer up a contract like that. The tit-for-tat killing continued, and all in all, it's estimated that around 40 lives were taken on each side. However, one day the Schultz entourage got a member of the Cole gang that would rip the heart out of their operation. On a Harlem street corner, Peter Cole, the brother of Mad Dog was cut down in a wave of submachine gun fire aged just 24. Vincent took Peter's passing very hard. 4 Schultz men fell before blazing guns in the next few weeks as the Schultz-Cole War reached its peak. It was from that moment on that the Dutchman became scarce around town and stopped frequenting the clubs of Manhattan. During this time of reclusiveness, to avoid any potential bullets from the end of Cole's gun, Dutch refound his love of reading, which started back when he was still Arthur Flegenheimer in public school 12. He was reading Dickens, American history and even Napoleon's autobiography. Whilst Schultz was making his way through his library, there was that many trucks hijacked, resulting in so many murders on both sides that the police, namely Fred Shadle, the same copper that Arthur had known for most of his life, found himself doing free guard duty at the Dutchman's beer drops, which the Dutchman welcomed. The police weren't exactly going to charge his band of merry men with rum running when they themselves still drank, and if it cut down on the murders that the Schultz-Cole War was producing, it was less pressure on them from all angles. At the height of the violence, perhaps the following single incident would illustrate best the no-limits nature of the war between the two factions. On February the 1st, 1932, a group of 4 gunmen entered a card game taking place in a 4-family framed dwelling on Commonwealth Avenue in the North Bronx. Without warning, they unleashed a hail of gunshots, catching everyone in the room off guard with no opportunity for a counterattack. Upon the police's arrival, Patsy Del Greco, affiliated with Cole and carrying a noteworthy police record, lay lifeless on the floor. Fiorio Bazile, another associate of Cole, met a similar fate, and Miss Emily Torrizello also lost her life in the gunfire. Louis Bazile, Fiorio's brother, sustained injuries along with another female guest. Remarkably, 2 children playing in the living room and 2 infants peacefully resting in the cribs emerged unharmed from the chaotic scene. The Schultz gunmen, however, were too eager, as Cole didn't arrive until 30 minutes after the shooting, otherwise they would have had their man. However, Cole's avoidance of gunfire would only last another 8 days. For several months, rumours circulated that a hefty $50,000 bounty hung over Mad Dog Cole's head, a cool $25,000 from Dutch Schultz, which was matched by Oni the Killer Madam, still enraged with Cole for kidnapping his business partner a few months earlier. Cole was posted up at the Cornish Arms Hotel on 23rd Street with his now wife Lottie, whom he had married shortly after being acquitted for the murder of 5-year-old Michael Vengali. At around 12:30 a.m, Cole left his lodgings, heading to the London Chemist drugstore across the street, likely for a pre-arranged phone call or to make discreet calls without attracting police attention. Carrying $101 and no weapons on him, he entered one of the free phone booths at the back. He allegedly called Oni Madden, either to ask for money or to threaten to kidnap him if he didn't pay. Things had been tough for the baby-faced Irishman. He was nearing broke, his crew was depleted, and he was still mourning his brother's passing. Listening to this sob story, Madden was able to keep Cole on the line long enough for a trio of Schultz killers to arrive in a limousine after 10 minutes of the Mad Dog wittering on with himself. 2 of them stationed themselves outside the drugstore while the 3rd entered and Bo Weinberg waited behind the wheel. Surveying the 5 individuals inside, 2 clerks, a woman and 2 male customers, he calmly announced, "All right, everybody, keep cool now and you won't get hurt." With a Tommy gun drawn from under his coat, the gunman positioned himself a few feet away from Cole's booth and unleashed a barrage of gunfire. Though an exact count of the bullets fired is unknown, Vincent Cole's body slumped forward out of the booth as the assailant made a quick exit. Cole sustained severe injuries with a slug shattering the right side of his face, breaking his nose and lodging in his brain. 2 additional bullets struck his forehead, 1 settled above his heart, and he suffered 7 wounds in the right arm and 4 bullet holes in the left. The machine gun wielding assailant left no room for doubt about Cole's fate. The gunman ran out and jumped into the limousine, and Bo Weinberg sped off. The ordeal for the Schultz men was not over yet. 2 police detectives, ironically assigned to tail Cole, came running at the sound of gunfire. One jumped on the running board of a taxi cab and ordered the driver to pursue the speeding getaway car. With the detective firing from the window of the taxi, they chased the gunman 27 blocks down 8th Avenue at 70 miles per hour before the getaway car pulled away. The Schultz-Cole War was over, and once again Dutch Schultz could sigh a breath of relief. He eventually started to frequent his favoured Swanee Club again, and normal service of bootlegging to the clubs of New York resumed, relatively violence-free. Picking up whispers from the circles of politicians and policemen he mixed with at the Swanee Club, the Dutchman was aware that Prohibition was coming to an end. The 18th Amendment of Prohibition had been a complete failure, and the White House knew this. You can't outlaw something so deeply embedded in American culture, and if people want to drink, people will still drink. All Prohibition did was encourage organised crime to flourish, and although alcohol consumption did decrease at the beginning, it had actually increased more than before the 18th Amendment was passed, and so on the 5th of December 1933, the 21st Amendment was passed and Prohibition was scrapped. It was finally legal to drink again, and bars reopened across New York. I say reopened, there was still an estimated 50,000 speakeasies across the city, so I guess they just stopped hiding what they were selling. This was great news for the population who wanted to drink. However, for a successful bootlegger like Dutch Schultz, this was going to take away the vast majority of his income. Schultz needed a new income stream, and one fell right onto his lap from the most unlikely of sources, his attorney, Dixie Davis, who introduced him to the Harlem numbers racket. Davis was an improbable figure to be a top commander of a New York racket. He worked his way through Syracuse Law School and was admitted to the bar in 1927. Davis was given a clerkship in honoured law firm, but he soon went into business for himself. Soon he became known around the mob as the boy mouthpiece. His work pleased clients who were all mobsters and gangsters. In court, he talked loudly and waved his arms, putting on a good show. He shouted in the courtroom, but in the back rooms he whispered, and his clients seemed to go free with increasing regularity. Crooked and corrupt through and through, he was a tailor-made lawyer for a man like Dutch Schultz, and knew that by introducing Schultz to the numbers racket, he could selfishly benefit even more himself, despite what chaos a maniac like Schultz would do to anybody who didn't comply. During the 1920s and 30s, as a massive influx of African Americans participated in the Great Migration, relocating from southern to northern and Midwest cities, Harlem emerged as the epicenter of Black America, fostering a vibrant cultural scene encompassing art, music and literature. Within this flourishing Harlem Renaissance, an illicit form of lottery known as policy or numbers gained prominence. In this clandestine game, participants selected 3 numbers between 0 and 999, anticipating a match with numbers drawn daily from public sources such as the New York Stock Exchange and the Federal Reserve's end-of-day credit balance. While the success of the policy racket relied on a substantial workforce managing slips and dispersing winnings, the pivotal figure was the banker, who provided the financial backbone for the entire operation. Though Harlem had numerous bankers, one individual stood at the pinnacle, Madame Stephanie St. Clair, also known as the Queen of Numbers. Details about St. Clair's early life remain shrouded in mystery. Born in the French West Indies, the specifics of a journey to New York, the acquisition of initial funds to establish her bank, and the circumstances surrounding her arrival are unclear. During her heyday, St. Clair was earning an impressive $200,000 annually, the equivalent of around $3.5 million today. She managed a team of 40 to 50 runners, had 10 controllers, and maintained several bodyguards. Residing in one of Harlem's most prestigious buildings, 409 Edgecombe, this was a residence shared with civil rights legends like W.E.B. Du Bois and future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, and 409 Edgecombe was regarded as the most prestigious and coveted place to live in Harlem for African American attorneys, dancers, designers, gangsters, musicians, and of course, our Queen of Numbers, Madame St. Clair, portrayed fantastically here in Hoodlum by Cicely Tyson. St. Clair diversified her wealth through real estate investments and was renowned for her exotic and fashion-forward dresses, vibrant turbans, and luxurious furs. She left an indelible mark on the cultural landscape of Harlem. During the Prohibition era, when money flowed as freely as the illegal liquor that fueled it, the policy game, collecting as little as a penny per bet, wasn't worth his time. However, Schultz's millions that he made from Prohibition wouldn't last forever with the amount of men he had in his crew and the amount of people he'd paid off, and unfortunately for Madame St. Clair, he wanted a slice of the numbers game. Operating essentially as independent bankers, policy in 1920s Harlem was regarded as a relatively harmless vice. Numerous upstanding citizens participated in running numbers banks. Policy operators like St. Clair intentionally enlisted reputable individuals to work in their banks, believing that such individuals would take precautions to avoid arrest. Teachers and unemployed wives of influential community leaders, individuals who would be deeply embarrassed by an arrest, were commonly employed in these policy banks. The policy had never seen men like the Dutchman before. Black policy operators were not seasoned criminals and violence was not inherent in their trade. Schultz knew this, but recognising that more than sheer violence was necessary, the Dutchman, in his move to control the policy operators, leveraged political influence from Jimmy Hines, the Tammany Hall West Side leader who was so corrupt he couldn't lie straight in bed. But with his influence, he could have any policeman that would sniff around the numbers racket relieved of their duties, and protection payments to the police who would play ball were facilitated by the Dutchman. Schultz's lawyer, Dixie Davis, represented many of Harlem's black policy operators and played a pivotal role introducing Schultz to Hines, and the trio, fueled by Hines's political protection, the Dutchman's firepower, and Dixie's ability to influence and control the policy operators made Schultz's newly organised policy combination a formidable money-making force. The Bronx Boys, or what was left of them since the Cole-Schultz War, initiated their takeover by summoning Alex Pompez, a prosperous policy banker who would later own the New York Cuban baseball team, to a meeting at the Oswego Democratic Club, a Tammany Hall hangout on West 118th Street. Pompez was informed by George Weinberg and Solly Gersh, two new recruits of the Bronx Boys, that he needed to pay $600 per week for protection. Joseph Eisen, another heavyweight policy banker, received a similar demand. Seeking counsel from his lawyer, Dixie Davis, Eisen was advised that resisting Schultz's forces would be futile. Acting as an intermediary, Davis and Eisen negotiated an agreement with Weinberg and his brother Bo, settling on $500 a week for protection. As part of the deal, Eisen requested protection from Josie Henry Myro, infringing on his territory. Schultz promptly summoned Myro to a meeting where he was instructed to pay $500 weekly for protection and stay out of Eisen's territory. Myro, having been on the receiving end of similar persuasive tactics at the Bronx Speakeasy, owners who weren't buying Arthur and Joey's beer years earlier accepted the terms, acknowledging the offered protection as necessary. Having secured control over Pompez, Eisen and Myro, the three biggest policy bankers after the Queen of Numbers, Schultz's next target was Stephanie St. Clair. However, St. Clair proved resilient, resisting Schultz's advances and publicising the Dutchman's politically backed attempt to seize her business in a prominently black-owned paper called Amsterdam News, where she wrote a weekly column. St. Clair and a key enforcer, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, staunchly resisted paying protection fees to Schultz, even in the face of violence and intimidation. In response to this defiance, St. Clair adopted an offensive strategy by launching attacks on the storefronts of businesses facilitating Dutch Schultz's betting operations. Simultaneously, she discreetly informed the police about Schultz's activities, leading to a raid on his residence. This operation resulted in the arrest of over a dozen Schultz employees. The Dutchman was annoyed. Unlike many others in Harlem, St. Clair remained steadfast in her refusal to submit to Dutch Schultz's dominance. However, Schultz had experience in something St. Clair didn't: all-out gang war, and the most violent prohibition criminal still walking was prepared to unleash hell to the tiger from Marseille, another nickname St. Clair had amongst Harlem folk. The Dutchman began beating, threatening and murdering her policy bankers. St. Clair, understanding that human life was more important than money, something the Dutchman didn't grasp, eventually succumbed to stop the war in Harlem, and Dutch eventually took over. Schultz had now made sure that every policy slip submitted in Harlem was now under his control, and his policy operation reaped enormous profits, with odds of winning at 999 to 1, yet the house only paid off at 600 to 1. The estimated daily take was around $35,000, of which only 25% went to the winners. After accounting for payoffs to the police and politicians for protection, Schultz still maintained an impressive profit margin, even more than he was making through the distribution of illegal booze. The Harlem numbers racket was a lot more lucrative than he could have ever imagined. The Dutchman improved his earnings when he brought Otto Berman into the fold. Known as Abba Dabba because he possessed a gifted mathematical mind and had the ability to figure out complex equations and algebraic expressions in the matter of seconds without the use of paper or pen, he was also born into a Jewish family in New York like Dutch. Abba Dabba was a successful accountant and, as everyone was in New York, aware of the fact that Schultz had taken over the numbers racket. Berman approached Schultz in 1932 with a $10,000 a week proposition. The daily winning policy numbers had arrived by the third digit in the amount paid out by the bookies in pari mutuel horse races each day. To explain this better, as it took me a while to understand it, pari mutuel is a type of betting used in horse racing where you're still backing a horse to win the race, but unlike fixed odds, your money goes into a betting pool with everyone else who is putting on a pari mutuel bet on that race and picking a horse to win. The idea is that if there's 6 horses in the race and $100 staked on each horse, thus $600 in the pool, and horse 3 wins at odds of 3 to 1, you'd have 50 people sharing $600 at odds of 3 to 1, so $1,800 divided by 50 equals $36 each, so they'd be in profit more than if they just put $2 on at 3 to 1 at fixed odds, which would have been $6 back. Anyway, moving on from the maths, there were 7 races a day at the Coney Island racetrack, which is where it was universally agreed the numbers would have been taken from. For example, if the bookies' payouts added up to $215.86 from the first 3 races, then went to $568.60 in the first 5, then after the 7 races the total went up to $845.76, our winning 3 numbers would be 585. Well, all Abba Dabba had to do was station himself at the Coney Island racetrack when the pari mutuel totals were being counted and set himself himself up at a telephone. Just before the 7th race, he would call up Bo Weinberg, the Bronx boy who counted the policy slips, and tell him which two numbers emerged from the first 5 races, 5 and 8 in the example we're using here. Weinberg would riffle through the slips from that day, all collected and sorted out by late afternoon, and tell Abba Dabba which digit from 1 to 10 on the 7 race totals would produce the most winning tickets, something they wanted to avoid to increase maximum profits. For example, if Weinberg told Abba Dabba that 583 and 585 would hurt the most, this is where the maths whiz would use his brain. Just as the bookies' windows were closing for the 7th race, Abba Dabba would go over the payoffs on the 6th race winners and then study the odds on all the horses in the 7th and put in a last-minute bet on one of the horses that would alter the payout no matter which horse won. This would make sure that the last number would not be a 3 or 5. It sounds very complicated and impossible, and that's probably why Schultz turned him down at first. However, after Berman went to the track with him and demonstrated his talent of how it would work, Schultz agreed without hesitation. Once, when asked about the success of Berman's efforts, Bo Weinberg replied, "Pretty near every day was a winning day." Implicating this method, Schultz's spoils from the numbers racket went from 5 million annually to a staggering 14 million by the end of 1933, the equivalent of around $300 million a year today. Quite simply ridiculous money for the time. Forever unable to satiate his preposterous greed, this wasn't enough for Schultz, and soon after completing the rackets, he carved out another money-making opportunity for himself involving union racketeering in the restaurant industry. In 1933, a key figure in the Schultz organisation, Julius Modgilevsky, more widely known as Jules Martin, established a small diner, disguising it as a greasy spoon, to serve as the front for infiltrating Local 16 of the Hotel and Restaurant Employees International Alliance. This local union oversaw waiters in Manhattan north of 14th Street. With the backing of Schultz now using his Tammany Hall connections and ever-trusty fearsome reputation, Martin's employees ran for union offices, stuffing the ballot boxes in order to obtain the positions of president and secretary-treasurer. Their efforts were so effective that they received 38 more votes than the entire membership of the union. The next move was to take over Local 302, another union that oversaw waiters in Manhattan. This time, instead of supplying his own candidates, Martin and another Schultz associate, Sam Krantz, simply advised the union's leadership to join them or else. The final step was to establish the Metropolitan Restaurant and Cafeteria Owners Association to sign up restaurant and cafeteria owners and collect protection money from them. Martin handled this task himself, muscling the owners into signing certificates of membership stating that they were doing so of their own free will. Jack Dempsey, the former boxing champion and owner of the well-known Dempsey's Restaurant, then located across the street from Madison Square Gardens, was even photographed signing the agreement. Unfortunately, that photo has been lost to time, but it just confirms how influential Martin could be. No one realised that it was Schultz who was behind the scenes working through Martin to build the illegal enterprise. Restaurant owners were told that the waiters' union was demanding a doubling of the wages, but this could be avoided if they joined and paid tribute to the association. One small cafeteria operator said he was forced to pay a $250 initiation fee and $30 annually in fees. In addition, he was told to pay $1,500 for association fees in order to avoid a threatened strike. Larger establishments were required to shell out initiation fees from $5,000 to $25,000 in addition to substantial annual fees. One owner who refused to pay tribute to the association was Hyman Gross. Having already invested $100,000 into his new restaurant, Gross refused to give in to the Schultz mobsters. One night, a stink bomb was dropped down the restaurant's chimney and Gross was forced out of business, losing his entire investment. The stink bombs the gangsters used were made of valerian or butyric acid. Once detonated, they created an offensive odour that permeated through carpets, draperies, wood and even concrete and plumbing. The acid would ruin all the tables and fixtures, causing replacement furniture to be purchased and leaving the restaurant closed for months, if not permanently. This became another unbelievably lucrative racket for Schultz, but all this money flowing into his accounts was not going unnoticed, and it wasn't a gun-crazed gangster who was going to be the next hurdle in Dutch's life, but a university man from Michigan who knew nothing of violence. Enter Thomas E. Dewey. Thomas E. Dewey was born in Owasso, Michigan in 1902. He attended the University of Michigan and graduated in 1923. He then enrolled at Columbia University Law School. After graduation, he joined a law firm where he met George Medali, a prominent attorney. Medali was so impressed with Dewey's legal skills that when he was named United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, he appointed the young Dewey to the position of Chief Assistant. Dewey gained valuable experience in trial preparation. He learned about the city's underworld structure factor in the relationship between gangsters and politicians. In early 1933, as Chief Assistant United States Attorney, Dewey took part in several income tax prosecution cases against policy racketeers including Henry Myro and Wilfred Brunder. Here he received his first exposure to Dixie Davis, who was both Myro and Brunder's attorney, as well as Dutch's. Dewey knew that Myro and Brunder were heavyweight policy bankers. They were little fish, however, compared to the amount of money everyone knew the Dutchman was bringing in each week. Dewey and the United States Attorney's Office began a tedious investigation into the bootlegging operations of both Schultz and Irving Wexler, better known as Waxy Gordon, another famous bootlegger who again is a video for another day. The case against Gordon went to trial in November 1933, with Dewey personally handling the prosecution. Waxy Gordon was convicted in December and received a 10-year prison sentence and a $50,000 fine. Schultz was indicted himself, and a federal grand jury in New York, spearheaded by the evidence Dewey presented to them in the court, proved that the beer baron of the Bronx had neglected to file returns during 1929, 1930 and 1931 on $500,000 of taxable income, and deduced that he owed the country over $90,000, the equivalent of $2 million today, slapping the Dutchman with income tax evasion, and he was now wanted officially by the feds. Of course, the monetary sum was of no problem for the Dutchman. He was raking it in with his policy and restaurant rackets, not to mention still sat on a healthy nest egg from his rum-running days. However, he had followed the papers closely, being an avid reader, and needed no reminder that the same tax rap had reduced Al Capone from underground king to a miserable existence on that dreadful rock just off the coast of San Francisco Bay people like to call Alcatraz. Al Capone owned Chicago, quite literally. He was also more powerful and had more cash than Schultz and most other gangsters in New York combined. It wasn't about the money. This was about people like Elliot Ness, the incorruptible cop who brought Capone down, or Thomas E. Dewey, also incorruptible, getting one over on organised crime. It came of no surprise that Dewey hit him with a fine of $110,000, and he faced a possible 43 years in prison if he was to stand trial and lose. But the Dutchman wasn't going to stand trial at all, at least not yet. In the first place, he was far too busy. The infinitely more complex and troublesome policy operation was taking up much of his time, and it was a racket he would soon need to squeeze every nickel and dime out of. There was an election coming up, and the Bronx boys had to cough up significantly to make sure Jimmy Hines could grease numerous palms to see that the right kind of guy occupied the office of District Attorney of Manhattan, an occupation which was currently vacant and one that Dewey would probably run for. Ultimately, the Dutchman decided he didn't have the time or interest to stand trial and went on the lam. I say went on the lam. For the next 22 months, Dutch Schultz would be considered a fugitive mobster, but he wouldn't be held up in a safe house or have to dye his hair and grow a mustache like Mad Dog Col. He wouldn't even leave New York. 50,000 of these wanted posters were printed and distributed across America, and apparently all 18,000 NYPD officers were hunting for the Dutchman. Many found that hard to believe. Schultz could be seen at his beloved Swanee Club most evenings, or if you'd like a face-to-face meeting with him, you could catch him conducting business in his luxurious 3-room apartment at 1212 Fifth Avenue, fully kitted out with tapestry and artwork. He would oftentimes be found gazing into the picture postcard view of Central Park from his 9th floor, $2,500 a year apartment, equivalent to about $55,000 a year today. Perhaps you wanted to see Schultz in a more hands-on business environment. Not a problem. Head down to his wide-open storefront headquarters of his policy racket at 351 Lenox Avenue in the very heart of Harlem, equipped with over 50 employees. He also took his girlfriend turned wife Frances out to the Embassy Club on East 57th Street before he'd spend all night at the Swanee Club. The hunted man was also available in public in the daytime as well. He'd spend most of his days at Polly Adler's whorehouse, which was now located in the Chateau Madrid on West 54th Street. Even though the sidewalk outside was soaked in his former partner Joey Noy's blood, the Dutchman made it his Manhattan headquarters and installed a dummy floor below, maintaining a lavish office complete with living quarters and a fortress equipped with enough weapons for a small army. He wouldn't stay confined to his bunker in hiding, however. He would oftentimes sit in the kitchen of the brothel and take part in his favourite pastime, reading. As Polly Adler recalls in a 1953 autobiography, A House Is Not a Home, she found her #1 customer Dutch Schultz in the kitchen with his feet propped on the table next to the window reading the life of Al Capone, obviously trying to get some tips from where he went wrong in his income tax evasion charge. This is the building where Polly Adler stationed her brothel, the Chateau Madrid. It's now a hotel, but in 1933 it was split into 2 buildings, 230 and 231 West 54th Street. The 3 windows on the side were number 231, and the window furthest right was the kitchen kitchen where Dutchman would be reading. Polly Adler mentions this small detail in a book released 20 years later because it stuck. This is meant to be a fugitive on the lam, on the run from the law, and here he is in the heart of Manhattan with 50,000 wanted posters in circulation, with one of the most well-known faces in America sat in a window reading. It shows a lot about the power, money and influence that the Dutchman had in New York, that he could go unbothered like this. Quite a feat given his humble beginnings selling subway transfers when he dropped out of public school 12. All of 1933 passed without law enforcement finding Schultz, who was operating freely right under their noses, mainly because the mayor's office was still in control of Tammany Hall, of which Jimmy Hines pulled the strings. Things were about to change. New Yorkers elected reform candidate Fiorello LaGuardia mayor in 1934. The Little Flower, as LaGuardia was known amongst New Yorkers, was soon putting the squeeze on the city's underworld. On November the 1st, 1934, LaGuardia received a telephone call from Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Secretary of the Treasury. Through this conversation, Morgenthau teamed LaGuardia with FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to put pressure on to finding Schultz. Hoover made the Dutchman his public enemy number one. Schultz's first reaction was to send Dixie Davis and Bo Weinberg with $100,000 to Washington, D.C. to negotiate a settlement. Morgenthau's reply when the pair walked in his office was, "We don't do business with criminals." Morgenthau was right. They didn't. A few years later, Al Capone, a bigger spender than the tight-fisted Dutch, offered him $400,000 before his trial was due to start, which was similarly declined. Schultz was in a predicament. He was now public enemy number one, a post which hadn't ended well for his predecessors. The quick-shooting FBI minions of J. Edgar Hoover had cut down bank robber and former public enemy number one John Dillinger outside the Biograph Theatre in Chicago. A few months later, their submachine guns put an end to Dillinger's colleague Homer Van Meter, who took the position of public enemy number one after Dillinger. Life on the lam was about to come harder, as there was no doubt the FBI would actually try and find the elusive Dutchman, unlike the NYPD, who were too busy spending the payoffs they'd received from him over the last 22 months. Schultz had two options: turn himself in or end up in a pool of his own blood just like the bank robbers before him. The Dutchman had no choice. On November the 28th, 1934, Schultz appeared before the United States Commissioner in Albany, New York. "I'm Arthur Flegenheimer," he said. "I'm under indictment in the Southern District of New York. I wish to surrender." With that short statement, 22 months as a fugitive came to an end. Bail was set at $50,000 and then doubled. This would be the longest period of time Schultz spent behind bars since his teenage years. Dixie Davis got the bail reduced to $75,000, but it took several weeks before the Dutchman was released. While he was absorbed in this government tax case and forced to remain in the Albany area, Schultz needed money and wanted to dip into his restaurant racket spoils. He called Jules Martin and ordered him to bring him $21,000 from the coffers of the association at once. Bo Weinberg and Dixie Davies accompanied Martin on the train ride. The three men met Schultz at the Harmony Hotel in Cohoes, New York. Schultz grilled Martin about $70,000 that was missing from the restaurant association's bank accounts. Schultz suspected Martin of investing the money in a factory he owned in Elkhart, Indiana, which rebuilt taxicabs. With both men drinking heavily, Schultz emphasized his point by punching Martin in the eye, after which Martin admitted to having removed only $20,000 from the accounts. Davies was not accustomed to this part of the underworld, witnessing the physical violence. He could hardly have anticipated what happened next, which Davies revealed years later. Dutch Schultz was ugly. He had been drinking and suddenly he had his gun out. The Dutchman wore his pistol under his vest, tucked inside his pants right against his belly. One jerk at his vest and he had it in his hand. All in the same quick motion, he swung it up, stuck it in Jules Martin's mouth and pulled the trigger. It was as simple and undramatic as that, just one quick motion of the hand. The Dutchman did that murder just as casually as if he was picking his teeth. Schultz apologised to Davis for having to witness the brutal murder. "You must hate me for this, Dick. Sorry," the Dutchman said, as Bo Weinberg and the new recruit to the Bronx Boys, Lulu Rosenkrantz, wrapped up Jules Martin's body in a carpet. A few weeks later, Martin's body was found in a snowdrift. However, when Dixie read the report in the paper, it noted that Martin's body was found with 12 stab wounds in the chest. Dixie later questioned Schultz about the knife wounds in the report, and Schultz replied, "Yeah, I cut his heart out. F*** him." This brutal murder clearly had no long-lasting effects on the Dutchman, as shortly after he was back trying to improve his public image. Just before the trial got underway, the Dutchman held a press conference. With Davis at his side, he answered many questions about his life and business activities. One of the questions was regarding his wardrobe. The underworld leader's appearance was sometimes ridiculed in the press. One reporter referred to him as an ill-dressed vagrant and stated that Schultz had a special talent for looking like a perfect example of the unsuccessful man. Schultz made no secret of of the frugality that governed his wardrobe. He said he never spent more than $35 or so for a suit or more than $2 for a shirt. He told the assembled press in the Syracuse conference, "I think only queers wear silk shirts. I never bought one in my life. Only a sucker will pay $15 or $20 for a silk shirt." Schultz's frugality was also apparent to Lucky Luciano, who later declared, "Schultz was one of the cheapest guys I ever knew, practically a miser. Here was a guy with a couple of $1,000,000 and he dressed like a pig. He used to brag that he never spent more than $35 for a suit and it had to have 2 pairs of pants. His big deal was buying a newspaper for 2 cents so that he could read all about himself." Before leaving the press conference, Schultz received a set of rosary beads from one citizen while another wished him good luck in Yiddish. Having never showed any interest in religion up until this point and was never taken to a synagogue by his parents, Emma and Herman Flegenheimer, Schultz accepted the token gestures. "I guess I'm going to need all the luck I can get," he said, "so I ain't passing anything up." The tax trial began on April 16th, 1935. John H. McEvers, a member of the team that successfully convicted Al Capone, handled the prosecution. Many of the early witnesses McEvers put on the stand were bankers who were used to detail the Dutchman's bootlegging income. The government had also forced 20 witnesses who didn't want to speak. One witness, scheduled to testify during an afternoon session, went for a morning walk, kept on walking, and never returned. Bo Weinberg and several other Schultz associates developed amnesia on the stand or pleaded the Fifth Amendment, aka the right to remain silent, even while being threatened with contempt of court charges by federal judge Frederick H. Bryant. Schultz's defense lasted an entire 3 hours. Calling just 3 witnesses, the Dutchman's defense was that he'd been given expert legal advice that he did not need to pay taxes on his illegal income. When this advice turned out to be false, Schultz made a concerted effort to pay his debt only to be rebuffed by the government. Outside the courtroom, Schultz explained to reporters, "I offered $100,000 when the government was broke and people were talking about revolution and they turned me down cold. You can see that at least I was willing to pay. Everybody knows that I'm being persecuted in this case. I want to pay. They're taking it from everybody else, but they wouldn't take it from me. I tried to do my duty as a citizen." On April the 27th, the case went to the jury. For a day and a half, Schultz walked the court's corridors nervously, chain-smoking cigarettes. Perhaps it was nervousness, but while Schultz waited, he spent much of his time making statements to the press on a variety of topics from his own life to Al Capone and Alcatraz. He had become a media celebrity and was seemingly enjoying the publicity he was receiving. Despite all of the government's evidence, the jury was hopelessly deadlocked. After the first day, the vote stood at 6-6. The second day, it was 7-5 for conviction. The judge discharged them at 3 o'clock on the afternoon on April the 29th. Schultz got away with this one, but a second trial was scheduled for Malone, New York, a tiny community located 10 miles south of the Canadian border. In what Paul Sang called a social rampage, Schultz arrived in town a week ahead of the trial to show the townsfolk that he was a regular guy. He picked up tabs in bars and restaurants, attended local baseball games with the mayor and prominent Malone businessmen. As the trial got underway, the prosecution's case was basically the same as last time. The reluctant witnesses came once more, and Bo Weinberg, with his faulty memory, was back again. In an effort to make Schultz seem more like one of them, the defense hired a local lawyer as lead attorney. The trial, which began in mid-July, went to the jury on August the 1st. After a 9-3 vote for acquittal on the first ballot, the jury came back on August the 2nd with a verdict of not guilty. Judge Bryant was furious and he banged his gavel to quiet the joyous outburst in the courtroom. He then went in on the jurors. "You have laboured long and no doubt given careful consideration to this case. Before I discharge you, I will have to say that your verdict is such that it shakes the confidence of law-abiding people in integrity and truth. It will be apparent to all who have followed the evidence in this case that you have reached a verdict based not on the evidence but on some other reason." Also disappointed at the trial's outcome was Mayor LaGuardia, who told reporters he will not be a resident of New York City. "There is no place for Dutch Schultz here," to which Schultz replied to the press, "Tell LaGuardia I will be home tomorrow." In reality, the acquittal was a surprise to Schultz and his defense team, not to mention his gangland peers in New York City. However, law enforcement was not giving up on Dutch Schultz and his time was running out. Schultz did not return to New York City, not even to Queens, where his wife Frances had given birth to a son. Instead, he took up residence at the Stratfield Hotel in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and later at the Barnum Hotel there. Schultz was still considered a fugitive because of an outstanding federal warrant for him on tax counts that was separate from the ones that he was tried on in Syracuse and Malone. In Connecticut, Schultz and his bodyguard, Luli Rosenkrantz, found themselves the darlings of the social set and were invited to several activities. One socialite reported to a New York Sun reporter, "My dear Arthur was the answer to a hostess's prayer. When it became known that he'd been invited to your party, you had nothing to worry about. Everybody came, and really, he was charming. It was hard to believe all those horrid stories." While socialising in in Connecticut, Schultz held meetings with his lawyers and Jimmy Hines. Schultz told Hines that due to his legal expenses, the Tammany Hall boss would have to take a 50% wage cut until the Dutchman's problems were cleared up. On September the 24th, 1935, Schultz checked out of Bridgeport and headed to New Jersey. In Perth, Amboy, Schultz was arrested again and booked on suspicion of being a fugitive. Bail was eventually set at $50,000 and on October the 1st, Schultz was released. He went to Newark, New Jersey, where he took a suite at the Robert Treat Hotel and began working on his public relations image again. Schultz held court at the Palace Chop House located around the corner from the hotel. He made sure that Lulu Rosencrantz and another New Bronx Boys recruit, Abe Landau, were present to keep undesirables away. The following is a sample of comments Schultz made to one reporter who interviewed him for the Newark Star-Ledger. "What about the Public Enemy #1 label? I never did anything to deserve that reputation," Schultz said, "unless it was to supply good beer to people who wanted it, and a lot of them did." "What about the future?" the reporter asks. "I want to settle down and be a plain citizen and be given a chance to earn a living. I want to be playing Arthur Flegenheimer and forget there ever was a Dutch Schultz. That bird has had too much trouble." But there was no forgetting there was a Dutch Schultz. Due to his previous acquittals, Dewey aimed to build a more substantial case against him, expanding the charges to include his policy empire. However, before Dewey could act, federal authorities indicted Schultz on October the 10th, 1935. To avoid double jeopardy, felony counts for tax evasion were dropped, and Schultz faced 11 misdemeanor charges of failing to file tax returns. The individual most concerned about Schultz's acquittal was Bo Weinberg. As Schultz's legal troubles drained his financial ventures, Weinberg feared the potential collapse of the Schultz empire. Seeking advice, Weinberg approached Longy Zwillman, a prominent New Jersey mob boss, who arranged a meeting with Luciano. During the meeting, Luciano claimed Weinberg offered to disclose all of Schultz's interests and hand over the empire to Luciano, Zwillman and their allies, who were already making moves in that direction. In exchange, Weinberg wanted to retain oversight of the operations and collect 15% of the profits. Luciano, feeling uneasy about the proposal, convened a meeting at his Waldorf Towers apartment, attended by Zwillman, Joe Adonis, Frank Costello, Meyer Lansky, Louis Lepke, Tommy Lucchese and Vito Genovese, all the Cosa Nostra heavyweights. Luciano explained Weinberg's deal, expressing discomfort with the idea of dismantling Schultz's territory before he was even convicted. They discussed the responsibility for dividing Schultz's empire, and in Luciano's division he assigned policy and gambling to Costello and Lansky, liquor to Adonis, restaurant rackets to Lepke and Lucchese, and other enforcement operations, and Zwillman received the New Jersey operations. After Schultz's acquittal, he realised changes had occurred and sought a meeting with Luciano. During the meeting, Schultz surprised Luciano by expressing excitement and discussing his interest in Catholicism. Schultz claimed that studying Catholicism had helped him during his tough times and contributed to his acquittal. Despite these religious revelations, Schultz eventually discovered who had betrayed him. In New Jersey, Schultz's men staked out Zwillman's estate, allegedly spotting Weinberg at Zwillman's home on September the 9th. Schultz, notified of Weinberg's presence, confronted him as he left. The fact that the Dutchman had now seen with his own eyes that one of the most loyal members of the Bronx Boys had betrayed him was not good news for Bo Weinberg, and later that day, Lulu Rosencrantz kidnapped Bo as he left a Manhattan nightclub, a kidnapping that was made easier as he had been on the whiskey since the altercation with Schultz. They took him out onto the East River in a speedboat the Dutchman had kept aside during his rum-running days, encased his feet in concrete and dropped him, still alive, into the river. Schultz apparently used this method a few times to dispose of his enemies, and he used to watch the bubbles break the surface of the water and smile when they stopped. He broke the news of his brother, also a Schultz loyalist, George Weinberg, by calling him and explaining, "We had to put a kimono on Bo," a cryptic reference the crew used to use regularly to explain that they concreted his feet and chucked him into the river. A psychopath through and through, only amplified by the anxiety that Thomas Dewey was causing him, Schultz had now taken out two of his highest ranking lieutenants without batting an eyelid, and he was starting to unravel. This was the beginning of the end. By the second week of October 1935, the federal government had indicted Schultz, and he knew that Dewey was working on a case involving his policy empire. As Schultz plotted a strategy, Luciano claimed to receive a visit from Albert Anastasia, also known as the Mad Hatter, the Lord High Executioner of Murder Inc. Anastasia informed Luciano that Schultz had asked him to stake out Dewey's fifth apartment to assess the difficulty of eliminating the special prosecutor. Luciano later revealed that the plot to assassinate Thomas Dewey was considered strongly. Albert Anastasia had personally conducted the research himself. This was an assassination that would cause so much heat, assassinating the special prosecutor of New York, that Albert Anastasia Anastasia didn't trust anyone apart from his own right hand. Keeping a close eye on Dewey's whereabouts, Anastasia dressed in black and pushed a pram, pretending to be a father on his morning routine. However, it was Dewey's he was really there to study. He deduced that Dewey's morning ritual involved leaving home with 2 bodyguards, entering a nearby drugstore and making a phone call from a phone booth. Anastasia thought he could carry out the hit at that point. The plan included a gunman with a silencer waiting in the drugstore until Dewey entered the booth, after which the assassin would kill the prosecutor and the shopkeeper. Luciano once again held a meeting with the commission and presented the information and potential plan that Anastasia had compiled. Schultz was also at the meeting at the Waldorf Towers in Luciano's suite. The consensus of the mafia bosses sat round the table, which was a mirror image of the ones at the Atlantic City conference a few years prior, and they all agreed that whacking the special prosecutor of New York would bring far too much heat onto organised crime, and it would be best to avoid it. Killing each other was fine, as Bugsy Siegel said, who was also sat round the table, but killing government officials could potentially put an end to everything they'd worked hard for, as the newly formed FBI were not messing around, as everyone in America knew, and they would surely turn their attention to Dutch and eventually to the rest of the underworld if Dewey was killed. Schultz pleaded with the predominantly Italian-based panel, but they didn't vote in his favour and unanimously voted not to whack Dewey. The Dutchman was incensed, in a livid rant insulting numerous members of the commission, including Luciano, and throwing racial slurs to the Italian members of the commission. "You won't do it? Then I'll whack Dewey myself," he told his fellow mobsters, "and he'll be dead within 48 hours. He confidently offered up this last detail before flipping a chair over and storming out of the meeting. He then turned his collar up, pulled his fedora down and crossed Lexington Avenue to where Lulu Rosencrantz was waiting for him in a Ford sedan, the Dutchman's vehicle of choice. Still exiled from New York and with new Mayor LaGuardia imposing a shoot-on-sight policy to the NYPD, they headed back to Newark, New Jersey and to the Robert Treat Hotel where Schultz had set up camp. The room he had left in a characteristic furious outburst at the Waldorf with the heavyweights of the American Mafia didn't need to discuss anything. Just one look from Lucky Luciano at Albert Anastasia gave the order to call the Midnight Rose Candy Store, their headquarters in Brownsville, and let Murder Inc. know that they had some work over the next few days. The beer baron of the Bronx had signed his own death warrant. At 6 o'clock on an unusually warm and pleasant evening, the Dutchman, the exclusive owner of New York's most extensive single policy combination generating $20 million annually, entered the Palace Chop House and Tavern on East Park Street in Newark, New Jersey. Accompanied by his 2 bodyguards, Lulu Rosencrantz and Abe Landau, the Dutchman swiftly made his way down the 60-foot bar to the round table in the back room. Not a single booth or table was occupied. The bartender, Frank Fredericks, promptly served their drinks as the trio settled in, shedding their top coats and hats. King Lou, the chef, initiated preparations for steaks and french fries, well aware of the customary routine upon the Schultz trio's arrival. As the evening progressed, additional patrons began to trickle into the palace. Michael Marks, a minor associate of the mob, claimed to have journeyed from the Bronx Grand Concourse to meet Lulu Rosencrantz for some walking around money. Later, Marks returned with Frances Flegenheimer, also known as Frances Maxwell, the Dutchman's wife, who arrived from her apartment in Jackson Heights, Queens. Frances, once a hat-check girl at the Maison Royale, now elegantly dressed in a brown velvet suit and a silver fox neckpiece gifted by Schultz, spent nearly an hour with him, interrupted briefly by a visitor. Meanwhile, out front, the bartender that night, Jack Friedman, tended to his housekeeping duties, shuffling around to keep him occupied. Despite the tavern's prosperous past as a thriving speakeasy, the present atmosphere was desolate. Friedman, reminiscing about better times, adjusted liquor bottles and checked the register before heading to the back for a cup of coffee. While enjoying his coffee, Friedman glanced out the window onto Park Street when suddenly a heavy-set man abruptly entered the barroom. "Don't move. Lay down," he ordered. He pulled his top coat to reaffirm the hiding of his face and placed his other hand on his left shoulder and removed his pistol from its holster. The heavy-set man, who had curly black hair and piercing brown eyes, packed 185 pounds of muscle on a wide 5'7" frame. He was in his early 30s and good-looking in a tough kind of way. This was Murder Inc. gunman Charles the Bug Workman. He was not alone. Right behind him, there was no way for Friedman to miss this dark and menacing presence, came a slightly taller man, obviously older, who kept his overcoat drawn around him but not buttoned. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, also an employee of Murder Inc. This was a pair of skilled and sure journeymen in a trade which had attracted ever-increasing recruits going back to the bootleg warfare of the 20s. The gunmen didn't need any directions from the terrified bartender. They headed straight for the dining room, for they had come to kill the Dutchman. Once a package thief and burglar, then a helper on a beer truck, then a partner in a 2-bit speakeasy in the Bronx, then the beer baron of the Bronx, then overlord of the the Harlem policy racket, then public enemy number 1 on the private list in J. Edgar Hoover's FBI office, and now at the tender age of 33, evidently public enemy number 1 on an even more formidable list. The executioners must have suffered a flickering moment of dismay when they stepped through that 10-foot passageway into the dining room of the Palace Chop House. Their information was that the man they wanted would be in the chair facing them, a perfect target under the bright orange-tinted light in that corner. He had been there every night for at least 3 weeks, conducting all his business there, seeing Francis Flegenheimer there, even entertaining select newspapermen there. He hadn't made that much of an effort, quite obviously, to keep his temporary command post in Newark all that secret, but the Dutchman wasn't at the table. It was no time to start asking polite questions, of course. The gunman in front opened fire, even though their main target was missing. He turned a .38 caliber pistol on the trio in the corner, firing across the room with a marksman's accuracy, whilst his huskier confederate swept the table with the sawed-off shotgun he had brought in under his coat. This part of the unequal shootout was over within seconds. Even as he whipped out his .45 Colt to return the invaders' fire, 7 slugs ripped into Lulu Rosenkrantz, spraying his strong and compact 5-foot 10-inch frame from his chest and his abdomen down to his right foot. The 36-year-old hoodlum must have had his back to the doorway, because one bullet went through his right wrist and 2 others landed in his right elbow and just above it, all from the rear. Otto Abadabba Berman, the oldest of the trio and the one least suited for this kind of adversity because he was dragging around 220 pounds on a stubby little body, was hit 6 times. All the wounds, body, neck, wrist, elbow and shoulder, were on the left side, so Abadabba, who was not armed, had to be in the chair in front of the window. He tumbled to the tile floor in a pool of blood and lay there moaning. Abe Landau, 4 years older than the taller Rosenkrantz but in reasonably good trim at 180 pounds, must have been facing Abadabba. The bullet which would do the most damage tore through his left shoulder from the back. Another one went through the upper left arm of the most dangerous of the Schultz gunners, and a third one tore a gaping hole through his right wrist while he was getting his 4.5 into action. There were remarkably few wasted shots in that room. 2 strays smashed the mirror, 4 or 5 other bullets lodged in the green walls, but they did not have to be strays, because 5 slugs went clear through Rosenkrantz's body, 4 went through Abadabba's and all 3 went through Landau. The Dutchman, of course, was on the premises and he was not to be spared. He had put on his light top coat and grey fedora and stepped into the men's bathroom just minutes earlier. As the duo of assassins inspected the wounded mobsters round the table and realised Dutch wasn't amongst them, they then took it upon themselves to go into the men's, where they encountered Dutch relieving himself into a urinal. Schultz was hit with a rusty steel jacketed 4.5 slug that crashed into his husky body just below the chest on his left hand side and tore through the abdominal wall into the large intestine, gallbladder and liver before lodging on the floor near the urinal he had been using when the door opened. Although his assailant talked of having fired only 1 shot, a second bullet also missed and smashed into the wall over the second urinal. Schultz just happened to go the other way minutes earlier on the October morning in 1928 when his boyhood chum and bootlegging partner Joey Noy was shot on the spot outside the Chateau Madrid. Schultz never even heard a shot fired in the 2-year war with Mad Dog Coll, a war that turned the Bronx and Manhattan into shooting galleries until a Tommy gun cut Coll into pieces in the famous drugstore ambush of 1932. Schultz suffered nothing worse than a superficial shoulder wound in early 1931 when he ran into another business rival, Chink Sherman, in Manhattan's Club Abbey, and the guns went off. Schultz ran that time, not this time. This time, he could neither run nor fight. The chances are that he didn't even know what had hit him. He just clutched his right side, the great hurt registering in his wide brown eyes, and stepped forward out of the toilet. Berman collapsed immediately after he was shot. Landau's arteries were severed by a bullet passing through his neck, and Rosenkrantz was hit repeatedly at point-blank range. Despite their injuries, both gangsters rose to their feet, returned fire and drove the assassins out of the restaurant. Weiss jumped into the getaway car and ordered the driver to abandon Workman. Landau chased Workman out of the bar and emptied his pistol at him but missed. After Workman had fled on foot, Landau collapsed onto a nearby trash can. Witnesses in the Palace Chop House that night say Schultz staggered out of the bathroom, clutching his side and sat at his table. He called out for anyone who could hear him to get him an ambulance. Rosenkrantz rose to his feet and demanded that Jack Friedman, who had hidden during the shootout, give him some change. Rosenkrantz called for an ambulance before he lost consciousness. When the first ambulance arrived, medics determined Landau and Rosenkrantz were the most seriously wounded and needed to be taken immediately to Newark City Hospital. The policeman on the scene waiting with Schultz decided to seize the opportunity. "You're Dutch Schultz, aren't you?" the Fed said. "Yes," came the weak answer. "Your real name's Arthur Flegenheimer, isn't it?" Yes. You're shot, aren't you? Yes, and it's damn painful. I think they got me in the liver. No, the police officer said. The wound's high. You got it through the chest. Well, get me off to a hospital, Dutch said. The ambulance is on its way. Who shot you? The answer came. I don't know who shot me. You've got a serious wound. Why don't you tell us who did it? I don't know, Schultz replied. I got bad cramps. Do something. The policeman turned to Jack Friedman and asked him for brandy. With his right hand holding a towel to his wound, Schultz took the glass in his left hand and downed the drink. Thanks, he said to the cop. That feels good. When a second ambulance arrived from Newark City Hospital, Schultz gave an intern in the ambulance $3,000 in cash before he thought he was dying and said that it was not going to do him any good where he was going. After surgery, when it looked like Schultz might live, the intern was so worried that Schultz would come back for his cash that he handed in the money. Schultz then asked for a priest. He was Jewish, however never religious, and he believed Jesus helped him to avoid that last indictment, so promised to convert to Catholicism. Landau and Rosenkrantz, who were already at the hospital, refused to say anything to the police until Schultz had given them permission after he had arrived in the second ambulance. Even then, they provided the police with only minimal information. Schultz was moved into his own ward upstairs, a ward without a window. The police figured by now that the word would have got back to New York that the Dutchman was still alive and wanted to take all precautions that they could to keep him talking. Get the hell away from me and get me an ice cream soda, Dutch shouts when the police again try to question him. The ice cream soda being such a strange request that it's at this moment that it is thought Dutch begins to enter a delirious state, caused by peritonitis from the rusty bullet which was intentionally loaded into the chamber of Charles Workman's gun, just in case Schultz didn't die at the scene. On a bench in the corridor, a lonely death watch gathered, including his mother Emma, his sister Helen and her husband Henry. Father McKinney, the priest Schultz had sent for, stayed with the family for much of the time. Emma had heard about the shooting on the radio in her Bronx apartment not long after it happened, and in the morning she had a call about it from a girl she had never met, Arthur's wife, Frances Flegenheimer. Arthur never told his mother about Frances. Was it because she was a Catholic? Was it because she was only 18? Was it because he had another wife somewhere? These questions would never be answered, surely not by the Schultz side of the family. The aging Emma Flegenheimer, indeed, professed to know as little about her son's flashy career as the affairs of his heart. Under gentle questioning from the police, she insisted that she'd never been aware of her son's eminence in the underworld, despite him being in the newspaper most days. Arthur never told me anything about his business, she said. I don't know why anybody would want to shoot him. She said she had seen him a few weeks prior, she didn't say where, and she said that he seemed very happy then. During this hospital stay, Frances Flegenheimer was occupied most of the time because the police thought she fit the description of the mystery woman, now very large in the headlines, who had visited Schultz in the palace a couple of hours before the shootings. The theory at first was that this woman may have led the firing squad to the scene. This was quickly discounted once the authorities had Frances in custody. She confirmed she'd been with Arthur a few hours earlier, but he had given her money to go to the cinema for a few hours whilst he handled some business. At 2:20 a.m, Otto Berman, the oldest and least physically fit of the four men, was the first to die. Abe Landau died of blood loss at 6 a.m. When Rosenkrantz was taken into surgery, the surgeons were so bemused that Rosenkrantz was still alive despite his blood loss and ballistic trauma that they were unsure of how to treat him. He eventually died from his injuries 29 hours after the shooting, but Schultz was hanging on. Dutch went into surgery and the rusty slug took 90 minutes to remove from his body, but the operation did nothing to help with the peritonitis and the delusion that the Dutchman was now succumbing to. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, mustering a smile and asking the doctor for another bonbon whenever he wanted some morphine, and remained this way until 2 p.m. the next day, 14 hours after Mendy Weiss and the bug had entered the palace chop house. The Dutchman asked Father McKinney to baptise him and give him the last rites. He knew his time was up. While Schultz was receiving the last rites, another kind of farewell, drawn from the New Testament, was being delivered to the hospital's reception desk by a Western Union messenger. As ye sow, so shall ye reap, said the wire. It was signed Madam Queen of Policy, and it had come, of course, from Harlem's Madam Stephanie St. Clair, the Queen of Numbers who a few years earlier Dutch had bullied out of Harlem and out of the numbers game. She got her just desserts. In typical Dutch fashion, when all looked like he was about to pass to the other side, he muttered the following words: "Journey's end, this is my death. Let them come, I'm not afraid of anybody. I won't run, they're just a bunch of fakers anyway." The peritonitis had really taken its course now and he was completely delirious, not knowing where he was or who he was for the most part. The doctors were startled he was even alive, let alone talking. The police again thought they could seize their opportunity to ask him questions and sent for a stenographer they had in the waiting room downstairs who jotted down every word. These have become known as the last words of Dutch Schultz, which you might have heard of. They have been turned into a play, studied in universities, converted to poetry and analysed by treasure hunters far and wide from this little hospital in Newark for hidden meanings. They are a strange stream of consciousness babble spoken in his hospital bed to police officers trying to piece together the puzzle of the Palace Chop House, and they are frankly too long to recite here, but I will leave a link to my website and a post I have done analysing his last words in the description for your perusal and highlight a few of the more bizarre and perhaps potential hidden meanings now. Certain extracts like "oh dog biscuit" and French Canadian bean soup are clearly nonsense and the ramblings of a dying man with a fever of about 106 degrees. However, phrases such as "a boy has never wept nor dashed 1,000 kin" or "mother is the best bet and don't let Satan draw you too fast" are glimpses of the poetic side of his last words, perhaps influenced by the characteristic that Schultz was a bookworm at heart, if he had one. However, I'm more interested in the phrases that explain some of the more elusive, mobster-soaked corners of his life. For example, "George don't make no bull moves" was one of the many phrases he splurted out on his deathbed in 1935, and I and Paul San, the writer of Kill the Dutchman, believe this is related to Joe Weinberg, brother of Bo, who Dutch murdered 2 months before. I think he's reciting something that was weighing heavy on his mind, the killing of Bo, and potentially the subsequent reaction from George. The brothers had been around gangs and organised crime since they were able to walk, however fairly new recruits to Schultz's gang, only joining when the policy began to take off a few years prior. We know that Dutch informed George of the murder of his brother in a nonchalant quote of "we had to put a kimono on Bo," an underworld code that he had encased his feet in cement and tossed him in the East River. I think on the same phone call, Dutch, wary of retaliation from George, told him not to make any bull moves and cool off. If indeed Dutch did say this to George, it worked as he never did retaliate. In fact, in the case of George Weinberg, after the death of Bo and the shooting at the Palace Chop House, he was picked up by the police, spearheaded by Dewey, and decided to become a government informant, testifying against his former associates until, in 1939, whilst under police protection in a safe house in White Plains, he grabbed a gun from the police and blew his own brains out. Perhaps that life left a lasting remark, or perhaps he feared the mobsters still walking, who he could connect to crimes, would come after him anyway. The next name the Dutchman blurts out is John. More specifically, "John, did you buy the hotel? You promised me $1 million, please." There was only one John in Schultz's inner circle that would have that kind of money, the former Chicago outfit boss Johnny Torrio. Torrio had moved to New York and let Al Capone inherit the outfit 10 years earlier after Jaime Weiss had ambushed him and left him for dead. Johnny and the Dutchman put a couple of $1 million together to buy a Manhattan hotel, which was later discovered from a letter in Dutch's artifacts that the deal had fallen through. The hotel, which was never named, must have been some affair, as a few million in 1935 is an astronomical amount today. And clearly the falling through of the hotel was playing on his mind as well. Perhaps the Dutchman was trying to use his ill-gotten gains from prohibition and his rackets to take a step into legitimate business amongst the heat from Dewey. The final thing I want to highlight from his last words is towards the end, when Schultz is taking his last few breaths on the planet. A policeman asks him again who shot him, to which Schultz finally offers up some information. "Me? The boss himself shot me. Why? Honestly, I don't know." The commission had recently transformed into the Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing in Italian. This had united the 5 families of New York under the Cosa Nostra, and Luciano, whose idea it was, had recently appointed himself the boss of all bosses. Dutch was aware of this as he found himself more and more pushed out of the commission, which was predominantly Italian, and they preferred not to shower in press conferences, avoid limelight, and most importantly, the newspapers. They also preferred to deal with matters peacefully where possible, and a hot-headed, limelight-crazy, press conference holding and front-page newspaper frequenting German Jewish miser like Schultz didn't belong, perhaps another contributing factor to why they decided to whack him. I think here he was referring to the fact that Luciano had ordered the hit. I think Schultz knew in that car journey back to Newark after storming out the Waldorf Astoria that he had signed his own death warrant, and no one else would have the nerve to come after the one-time beer baron of the Bronx. More rambling continued, and his last words to the police officers who were still trying to squeeze out incriminating information was, "Let them leave me alone." The closing line came on the stroke of 6 p.m. Then the Dutchman fell into a deep coma. The stenographer was withdrawn, and finally the police themselves left the overcrowded little room. At 8:20 p.m, sensing that the end was near, Dr. Snavely, the head doctor on shift that night, gave the word to let Frances Flegenheimer come in and say her farewell. She went to the bed, bent over and whispered again, "Arthur, this is Frances." There was no response and she left, sobbing. About 15 minutes later, Dr. Snavely was checking the pupils of Schultz's eyes and putting his stethoscope to his chest. Then the doctor looked up to his colleagues and said, It's all over. The Dutchman had succumbed. He had cheated the enemy out of nearly a whole day after the slugs were first pumped into his body, but I think that karma had caught up with Dutch Schultz, or Arthur Flegenheimer as we used to refer to him as. He lived a life of violence incomprehensible to most people, and as they say, if you live by the gun, you die by the gun. The death certificate put it as 8:35 p.m, then someone drew the sheet up over the Dutchman's head and Dr. Snavely went out into an adjoining room where the next of kin now waited. He went directly to the bent little woman in there as she arose. "Emma Flegenheimer, your son has died." As the Dutchman's mother collapsed into the arms of her daughter, revived in a few moments, she was taken to the bedside where she prayed in silence for 15 minutes. Then she was led downstairs where she collapsed again outside the hospital, even as Helen, the Dutchman's sister, was pleading with a swarm of reporters. "For God's sakes," Helen said, "can't you stop pestering us?" On October the 28th, the staff of Daniel F. Coughlin and Brothers, a funeral home, managed to discreetly move Schultz's coffin from the parlour to a hearse at 4:30 a.m. They knew that this coffin was going to attract a crowd. By 6 a.m. there was over 1,000 people outside their funeral home, and another 2,000 were on the balconies of the Roosevelt Hospital before they were informed that the body of the Dutchman was already on the way to the cemetery and that they were too late. Between 4:30 and 10 a.m. they drove through the city, stopping for coffee breaks along the way. At 10 a.m. they escorted the hearse to the Gate of Heaven Cemetery for burial. There, Father McKerney performed a 15-minute service as normal for converted Catholics, and Emma Flegenheimer, who was bent in uncontrollable sorrow, had a Jewish prayer shawl draped over the coffin. The Flegenheimers wanted to keep it small and private, with only Emma, Helen and her husband Henry present. Thus, the violent life of Arthur Flegenheimer, aka Dutch Schultz, who was born into poverty to 2 German immigrants, murdered, intimidated and bribed his way up to the top of the New York underworld before he was taken out by his peers, was over. He was 34 when he died, but managed to cram so much into those short years that he's still talked about today, and that is mainly due to the aftermath after his death. Schultz's rackets were inherited by the mafia, another motive for taking him out, and divided between the 5 families. The restaurant racket eventually ceased in the 40s due to less corruption in the police and more enforced laws. The numbers game, or policy racket, did sit with the mafia, or the National Crime Syndicate as Lucky Luciano branded it for a while, but eventually it was given back to the bankers of Harlem and is still loosely operated today. The commission went on running the underworld for various years until Dewey finally pinned Luciano down, just as Dutch had foreseen and warned before storming out of the Waldorf. Dewey investigated Lucky for a few years, just as he had with Dutch, and eventually tried and convicted him for running a prostitution racket, eventually sentencing him to 30 to 50 years in prison, where he continued running the crime family. His trusty right-hand man, Meyer Lansky, who was also dubbed the accountant of the mob, struck a deal during World War II with the Navy, who were concerned with German and Italian agents entering the US. Knowing that the mafia controlled the waterfront, Luciano provided assistance to the government through World War II and was deported to Italy in 1946 and died a free man in 1962. On July the 14th, 1937, 2 years after the Dutchman's death, a grand jury issued a dozen indictments related to the policy racket. Leading the list was Dixie Davis, the former attorney for Schultz, who had control of the Harlem numbers operations before he introduced the Dutchman into the frame. Despite their extensive involvement in illegal activities, Thomas Dewey was open to negotiations with Davis to pursue the conviction of corrupt Tammany Hall leader Jimmy Hines. Davis agreed to a plea bargain for a reduced sentence in exchange for testifying against Hines. On May the 25th, 1938, Jimmy Hines was arrested for his involvement in the numbers operation. His trial commenced on August the 15th, 1938, with Davis as a key witness. However, in September, the trial ended in a mistrial to a comment made by Dewey about Hines' past involvement in a poultry racket. In 1939, Hines faced a second trial, and in February he was found guilty on 13 counts and sentenced to 4 to 8 years in prison. He entered Sing Sing prison on October the 14th, 1940, and was released in August 1944 before passing away in 1957. Dixie Davis received a 1-year prison sentence for his cooperation and relocated to California after his release. In a tragic turn of events, on December the 31st, 1969, Davis suffered a fatal heart attack following an armed robbery in his Bel Air home. Frances Flegenheimer, Schultz's companion who bore him 2 children, moved away from New York to raise her family away from public scrutiny. Abe Relis's testimony, a major figure in Murder Inc., led to the trial of Charles the Bug Workman for Schultz's murder. Workman changed his plea to no contest 8 days into the trial and was sentenced to life in prison, eventually being released in 1964. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss met a grimmer fate, being found guilty of murder alongside Lepke Buchalter and Louis Capone. Despite appeals to Governor Dewey, they were executed in Sing Sing's electric chair on March 4th, 1944. Dewey was elected District Attorney of New York County in 1937, served 3 terms as Governor of New York starting in 1943, and ran for president twice but was unsuccessful, passing away on March 16th, 1971 in Bal Harbour, Florida, at the age of 69. His son later explained that even up until the day he died, he would never sit next to a window, not even at home. He would always have to sit with his back to the wall. When he found out later how close he was to being assassinated by Albert Anastasia, he was really shook up. You could argue that the Dutchman became more famous after his death, even though he was quite famous during his life, as he was on the front pages of the papers most weeks in New York. However, it's scarce that mobsters from Prohibition are known widely today or even spoke about regularly. Schultz was not only an anomaly as not the stereotypical gangster, but also an anomaly that he is still spoken about today. Dick's CBS show called Secrets of the Dead, where they have an episode on professional treasure hunters who are trying to hunt Dutch's treasure. A legacy that is still relevant today. That became the most famous mobster in America at the time and is still on the lips of many today.